Well, hey friends, welcome to another week at the Durango Vineyard. I'm just so glad you're with us. And in this series, we're talking very specifically about God's kingdom coming and what does that mean practically. This week, we're talking about lust and sexuality. You don't want to miss it, and you want to jump into this conversation with your whole heart. And hey, just a reminder, we've got our Easter service coming up at Tico time. I hope you can make it. We're going to be outside in a festival-like atmosphere starting at 11 o'clock. God bless you guys. I look forward to seeing you there. In one of Jesus' most famous prayers, Jesus said, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." In this series called Your Kingdom Come, we look at Jesus' specific words about what that kingdom looks like when it comes to earth. This week, we tackle lust. Here's what Jesus said. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." When I think of sex, lust, and our culture, and then Jesus, here's one thing I know. Jesus sets a high bar. But what are we supposed to do with it? And how do we jam all the cultural influences that we're feeling right now into these words? I mean, it feels like it's sometimes they're at odds. When I think of sex and our culture, a couple words come to mind. Sex being an incredible gift. Sex being a weird thing to talk about as a parent. Hashtag me too. Sexual abuse, rape, homosexuality, gender, transgender, conversion therapy, divorce, adultery, monogamy, monogamish, judgmentalism, sex before marriage, hookup culture, pornography, masturbation, prostitution, sex slavery, incest, sex in media and advertising, women's rights, purity retreats, sex drive, sex education, just to name a few. Here's what I know. Whenever I bring up this topic, or when we try to bring up this topic in church, we've got two distinct tensions, probably more, but two really stand out to me. One is this dramatic fear about where our world might go with sexuality. I mean, there's a real fear for us that at the rate that culture is changing in terms of the way we see sexuality, what if it doesn't stop? What if it gets weirder and harder and worse? And then there's this other side of the tension, and that is just the reality that what if our views, our maybe narrow views, have put down or oppressed people or caused people to lose God in the whole process? I mean, what if it's our morals that have actually pushed people away from God? I feel both of these things, and I think the nucleus that surrounds sexuality it just makes me uneasy. And yet I so desperately want to have these conversations because I desperately want to know, what is God's vision? What is the kingdom vision for sexuality? You know, regardless of where we feel about this subject, I know this for sure. God created our sexuality, and it's to be special, delicate, beautiful, and cherished. So what did Jesus mean when he talked about lust happening in the heart? To answer that question, we've got to dig deeper. We've got to read the whole scripture. Let's do that together now. "You've heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown in hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body and go into hell. It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Whew. I mean, these are some big statements by Jesus. Let's try to figure out what he's saying. First, he says, "You have heard it said." And I just think he brings up an obvious tension here. The culture versus his way. He's just basically pointing out a really obvious tension. And that is the culture that we're surrounded by is not necessarily in line with God's kingdom vision for sexuality. Madonna said something so interesting in the 90s, something that I read a while ago and filed away in my notes because I just thought it was fascinating. She knew that culture had a dramatic effect on how we feel about things. She said about homosexuality in her music videos in 1991, this is what she said. They, being the people, will digest it on a lot of different levels. Some people may say it and be disgusted by it, and maybe they'll be aroused by it. But if people keep seeing it and seeing it and seeing it, eventually it's not going to be such a strange thing. I mean, that's a profound statement, whether you agree with what she did or not. What she's saying is, the more we're exposed to a certain kind of thought, the more we're desensitized to it, and the more we accept it as true. Here's my point. Do we want to know what God says is true, or do we want to know what we sort of think and assume are true? But Jesus constantly reminded us that God's way and our culture's way are not usually aligned. James 4:4, he later, looking back at Jesus, says this. He said, "Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God." I think this is actually a really big deal. We're not demonizing culture necessarily. We're just acknowledging that culture and God's kingdom are likely different. In that, it's a choice. It's an invitation for you and me to say, well, what's the way I want to live into? If I want to live the way everyone around me is living, I'll get what they get. If I want to live the way that God's kingdom is inviting me to, then I'll get what he promises. You know, in this culture versus God's way, I read a book a while ago that I came back to recently, and it's called Cheap Sex. Now, this book is not written from a religious perspective. The author, Mark Regnerus, he just basically from a purely studying perspective, a psychology perspective, just has been tracking how our culture has changed in its view of sex. Now, what I think is so interesting is he defines the traditional model of how we saw sexuality as a culture versus the predominant modern model. He calls these things, he calls the original model the romantic model, romantic love, and he calls the new kind of cultural way of seeing sexuality the pure relationship model. Here's how he would define it after hours and hours and hours of research, of meeting with people and hearing their stories. The pure relational model, which is our current cultural model, is the contractual assumption that two individuals with equal rights unite for emotional and individualistic purposes. With confluent love in the pure relationship, contingency is the foundation. Equality is the organizing principle. Taste and emotion are its barometers. Discovery is a key goal. And while the dyad, the couple, is in basic structure to the union, it's never to usurp the individual's primacy and will. Now, did you catch that? Basically, he's saying that the current model of sexuality in our culture is sexuality is meant to meet my needs first. And he says that's way different than the traditional romantic view. Okay? Whether you believe in this or like it or not, I mean, this is what he says cultural used to think of in sexuality. Romantic love, which seeks to solidly preserve the object of care, to add to the world, and expand by giving itself away to the object of love. I think the second one is a lot more like Jesus. And so let's go back to this scripture and try to make sense of it. What is the vision? What is the kingdom vision that Jesus is promoting? Now, if you look at it again closely, you'll see it approached in terms of negatives. And I don't know why Jesus did that. You know, he approaches it by even saying things like, if you do this wrong, you'll be liable to hell. I mean, these are strong words coming from Jesus. And obviously the writers, when they were hearing Jesus, this was a lot to take in. But I think what we can see for sure is, why is he porting such a stark or intense view of sexuality? And that's because he believed in a different kind of union or giving, a union that was truly for the individual, or for the unity, for the couple, not for the individual. This word lust, I looked it up because I was just so interesting. What does it mean anyway to have lust in your heart? And this word is actually not a sexual word. The word comes from the Greek word epithemio, and what it means is to passionately desire. Interestingly enough, this is used all over the scripture for other non-lustful things. Like, for example, the prodigal son. Remember the younger son runs away, he gets poor, and it says in Luke 15:16, and he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pig ate. That word longing is the same word for lust. He intensely desired it. And then later, you remember when Jesus prayed about the Passover, he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Passion, right? I desire it, I want it. That's what Jesus used to describe adultery in our heart. What is he talking about? Well, I think James actually articulates it really well. Kind of ties the bow, for me at least, on Jesus' vision of sexuality. He says in James 4, what causes quarrels and fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war with you? Passions, same word, lust. You desire, same word, lust. You desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask, and you do not ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your lusts, passions, you adulterous people. And then he says the phrase that we just read, do you not know that the friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend with the world makes himself an enemy of God. Practically, what's that look like? When our passions become more important than everything else. When our passions dictate and dedicate how we live in this world, that is when we depart from God's kingdom view. I mean, the kingdom view that Jesus invited us into is not a world where your needs trump everything else, or mine. It's a world where our needs subject themselves under the needs of everyone around us. And this, I think, is what we actually all want. Don't we want a world where people are more selfless than selfish? A world where people care for the needs of others versus, focused on themselves? I think that's actually what we desire, and that's what Jesus was painting. This was said so well by a book that I read by a guy named David Bennett. And he's a homosexual man that is trying to find Jesus. And he wrote a book that is just fascinating called A War of Loves. Here is what he came to say about his sexuality and God. I came to see that God had covered me with the hem of his garment and pledged his covenant of love to me as a part of his bride, the church. He said to me, David, you are not ultimately celibate, gay, or any of these titles or labels. While they are part of your reality now, the ultimate reality is that you are betrothed to me. My love is your true identity. While I still use words like gay and celibate to describe myself, what ultimately defines me is God's overshadowing covenant love. And he invites all people, including those like me, into this same holy, covering relationship. This idea is so different than our world, where in the pure relationship model, we seek satisfaction of ourselves first. I mean, I don't have it all figured out. Going back to all those words I said at the beginning and the tensions that I feel that I'm sure you feel. I'm not sure how to just put Jesus neatly in the middle of it and just say, he says this and therefore do it. But what I do know is that the principle is centered in this idea that our sexuality, our desires are meant to be first met by God and then given to serve other people. I actually believe that our sexuality is most satisfied not when we get what we want, but when we give what others need. It's going to take some time to think about this new way of thinking about it, isn't it? So I'm excited about where this goes in our discussions. Just know there's tons of grace for us as we try to explore these subjects. Our world would tell us there's not, but I believe there is. So keep living, eyes wide awake, and God bless you as you wrestle with this topic. All right, it's question time. Hey, jump in with your whole heart in these things. There's plenty of grace for you in this. First question, what fears do you have about sexuality and our culture? All right, second question, God created sexuality, so what do you think is his vision for sexuality? All right, next question. We briefly, well, I read it, but we didn't talk about it at all. But Jesus says, if you're struggling with these things, cut your eye out, cut your arm off. What do you think he means? And why do you think he is so intense about his application? And I've got one more question today, just so that we got plenty of things to discuss. How can you be an advocate for God's vision of sexuality in our culture? God bless you.